Okay, so we've looked at how to define things in templates and how we can find out what values we can use, what parameters we can use, how to trace that through the templates, how it relates to Puppet modules. But how can we check that it's actually been set, like something you've set is actually being applied, more than just looking at the end result? So when you change a setting and you run overcloud deploy, it adds that value to the heat stack. So if we look at this, for example, we know that I set a sysctl value for RP filter. So we should be able to find that in the heat stack environment. So we do an openstack stack env show and then overcloud because that's the name of our stack. And we can see that the same value that I set in my template for kernel args has been set here. We'll cat it so that we can compare. So that value we can see in the environment, and we can do that for example, allocation ratio as well. We do allocation. So we can see all the allocation ratios and specifically the RAM allocation ratio and the CPU allocation ratio that we set earlier. So all of this ultimately becomes what's called the plan. And the plan we can get from Swift. So if we make the Swift, cd into Swift, and then we do openstack container save overcloud. So we're going to download all of the data that we've uploaded to Swift, and we're going to download it into this directory, and then we'll have a look at the plan environment.yaml file. So basically what happens with our overcloud deploy command is anything we pass with a -e will get concatenated into one big file, and that file is the plan environment file. So if you need to check that something you have added to the overcloud deploy in an environment file has actually been added, you can download the Swift data, just like I've done here, and we can see plan environment.yaml. So we vi plan environment.yaml. These are all the variables that are going to be provided to our overcloud deployment. So if we look for sysctl, for example, we can see that value we looked at. If we look for allocation ratios, we can see those variables that we've provided. And this is also all of the defaults. So anything you haven't defined that has a default is going to be defined in here. For example, network deployment actions is always set to create. If you wanted to change the network's post-deployment, you would need to modify this variable and set it to create or update. And that can be done on a per role basis as well. But we can see all of our networks are here, all of our allocation pools, everything that's been defined is in this one file. So you could just pass this one file, a single file with all of your variables. The names for your overcloud deploy command are really just arbitrary and they don't matter. If we have a look at my deploy command again, I could take all of these, anything with a -e, I could put it all in one big file and that would work. But there are a few things here, like for example, network environment and network isolation. These files don't actually exist. These are the rendered versions of these files. If I do file on that, we can see it doesn't exist. But what does exist is a j2.yaml version of that file. So this gets rendered when you run the deployment. You can't pass the non-rendered version of the file because that won't work. It's not technically a valid heat environment file at this point. It needs to be rendered first. And that happens during the deployment. So what we add into our deploy command is the end result of that operation. So these two here, for example, these are files that will be rendered when I run the deployment, and they will exist post-deployment. And we can see them in Swift as well, if we go back to Swift. And environments. So that's the rendered version of the file we just looked at. So if you want to find something, just check that you've defined it in an environment file, run your deployment, and then you can check with openstack stack env show, and you can also download the data from Swift to make sure that it exists in the plan environment file, or in the case of a rendered file that doesn't exist yet, but you want to add it, like network isolation, you can check the rendered version of all the files here. And if you're using older versions of TripleO, like train or queens or something, you could go into the network file in Swift and you would have a directory called config, and in that would be your rendered network config files. And that's often the easiest way to find out what the end result looks like. And in some cases, you may even want to render those files before the deployment and add the rendered version to your deployment in the network overrides file, just to make it a little easier to understand. And an example might be you might want to define the rendered version of the file for these software configs if you're using train or queens, and that makes it a little easier. And I'll leave a link to doing that in the description below. But hopefully that helps to understand the full process of how these templates are rendered and used in the deployment.